Another aspect of the market revolution was the development of the factory system. Stop for a moment to consider how goods were produced prior to industrialization. Most Americans were subsistence farmers, which also meant that they manufactured most of their basic goods by hand. Items which required more skill were produced in small shops by master craftsmen. The introduction of the factory system slowly began to replace these methods of production. The first product to be extensively produced in factories was cloth. Again, think of items that an ordinary farmer might need. Much of what they had to purchase rather than manufacture themselves were durable items made out of iron, such as tools, plows, or kitchen pots. These could last for years or even decades before being replaced. Cloth, however, was a universal consumer good that wore out relatively quickly. It was also relatively arduous to produce by hand. First, the cotton or wool fibers had to be combed or carded to straighten them out, and then spun into thread. Once this thread was produced, it was woven on a hand loom into a cloth, which could be used to make clothes. For much of human history, housewives undertook these time-consuming tasks on spinning wheels and looms in their own homes. The development of highly mechanized production of cloth first took place in Britain during the 18th century, and until the early 19th century, most manufactured thread in cloth in the United States was imported from there. However, the War of 1812 and the trade embargoes which preceded it created a situation which encouraged the development of domestic manufacturing. These events not only created a demand for these manufactured goods, they also freed up a lot of capital. Restrictions on trade badly damaged the shipping industry. Merchants who had made a fortune in commerce began to look around for alternative ways to invest their money, and what they found was manufacturing. In 1808, there were just 15 textile mills in the United States, but by 1809 there were 90, and even with the resumption of trade following the war, the textile industry continued to grow. Markets, of course, were critical. Without access to a mass market, mass production makes no sense. As the transportation system of the country grew, so did access to markets, creating incentives for entrepreneurs to establish factories. Pretend that you're an early 19th century entrepreneur. What would you need to set up a textile factory? Well, one of the first things you would have would be money. Much of this investment capital came from private fortunes, but we also see the establishment of financial institutions and laws which help provide resources for businesses. This era witnessed a huge increase in the number of banks, which used the pooled assets of depositors to finance loans. In 1811, there were just 88 state banks in the country. By 1816, there were 246. It was during this time as well that we see the development of stock markets, which initially provided investment funds for banking and transportation corporations. The New York Stock Exchange, for instance, opened in 1817, followed by the Boston Stock Exchange in 1834. The rise of corporate firms was encouraged as well by changes in the law, such as the development of the concept of limited liability. Prior to this, if you invested your money in a corporation, you were fully liable. That is, if the corporation went bankrupt, all of your assets could be seized to pay its debts. Obviously, this rather discouraged people from investing. With limited liability, however, you're only liable for the amount of money you invested. Once you had the financing, you could then acquire the machinery you would need to set up a factory. The British government attempted to keep the key technology necessary for textile production a state secret. They prohibited the export of any machines or the immigration of any people who had the technical capability to produce this machinery. In 1789, however, a man named Samuel Slater slipped out of Britain, carrying in his head the plans for the complicated equipment necessary to mass-produce thread. A bit later, plans for power looms to weave cloth out of this thread were also smuggled into the country. Americans proved to be extremely adept at improving upon these designs. This genius for machinery sprang in part from the economic reality that the U.S. was a labor-poor society. With relatively great opportunities to take up land in the West, it was difficult to recruit a large workforce to labor in factories. Efficient machinery just became a necessity. Machines, of course, cannot operate without a power source. When we think of factories, we traditionally think of them as being in cities with big smokestacks billowing out soot. But this was not the case until much later in the 19th century. In the beginning, factories were quite rural and scattered because machines were not driven by steam or electrical engines. They depended instead upon water wheels turned by rapidly moving streams. As it happened, the New England countryside was rich with these types of streams. You also needed raw materials. The textile industry in England had begun principally with wool and then with cotton imported from India. The key problem with cotton was that, except for some rather difficult to grow varieties, the cotton fiber is tangled with sticky seeds which had to be laboriously removed by hand. Eli Whitney's invention of a simple device that could easily remove these seeds, the cotton gin, made it possible to exploit varieties of cotton which throve in the southern climate. With the growing demand for cotton from first English and then American textile mills, cotton very quickly replaced tobacco as a stable crop in the South. In 1790, just 3,000 bales of cotton were exported from the South. Whitney invents his gin in 1793, and by 1800, 73,000 bales were being exported, and then 178,000 in 1810, 335,000 in 1830, and by 1850, over 2 million bales, 70% of the world's cotton. This explosion of cotton was ultimately both good and bad for the South. It was good because tobacco had long been failing as a good cash crop. It was bad because the development of cotton perpetuated the institution of slavery. For the North, of course, the growing plantation cultivation of cotton meant an abundant source of cheap raw materials for their textile mills, ensuring that the economic systems of the North and the South would remain intertwined. Even with labor-saving machinery, you also still needed a large labor force. The problem was that native-born men were not particularly interested in working in factories. Part of this reflected the relative abundance of land for farming, but it was also a product of American ideology. American men were ambitious to be independent, to own their own farm or shop. Becoming a wage earner in a factory smacked of slavery, dependence. One solution was to recruit women. The most famous example of this was the development of the Waltham system, which took root in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. The establishment of the system did pose some problems. It violated accepted ideas of feminine behavior. While women had engaged in manufacturing for a long time, remember the traditional spinning wheel, they typically engaged in these activities within the confines of their own home. Going out into the public to work was still considered a more masculine role. Early factory owners sought to create an environment which fit prevailing ideas of gender roles. Parents were assured that their daughters would be closely supervised. Women lived in dormitories staffed by matronly supervisors. Church attendance was mandatory, and temperance regulations and curfews rigidly enforced. Despite the hard working conditions, for many women the textile mill was a liberating experience. It provided a degree of independence at a time when few women had the opportunity to be out on their own, earning their own living. When the English author Charles Dickens came to visit these American mills, he was favorably impressed, comparing them to the misery he found in English factories. There were also opportunities for education. Many women, despite the 12-hour days and 70-hour work week, found time to attend lectures and study groups, and even at Lowell, to publish their own literary journal. However, this phase of industrialization did not last very long. A competing and increasingly popular form of labor recruitment was known as the Rhode Island system. In the Rhode Island system, not single women, but whole families were recruited to work in the mills, with the men doing the heavy work and women and children doing the lighter jobs. This too was a paternalistic system. The family typically lived in a company village, owned by the factory owner and closely supervised by him, but it was much less benevolent.